الإنجيل كلمة مفردة، لكن الإنجيل في الواقع هو مجموعة كتب، تحديداً 66 كتاباً. هذه الكتب سميت كتاباً لأنها تشكل رسالة واحدة. الرسالة تتعلق بمحبة الله للإنسان. هذه المحبة ظهرت في مجيء المسيح ابن الله إلى عالمنا ليحمل عقاب خطايانا ويخلصنا من الدينونة بقيامته من الموت. كل واحدة من هذه العقائد، أن المسيح هو الله، وأنه حمل العقاب عنا بموته على الصليب، وأنه قام من الموت، وجهت بالنقد والتشكيك. البعض يدعي أن يسوع كان مجرد خرافة وليس له وجود في التاريخ. كيف يمكننا أن نعرف أن يسوع عاش حقاً على هذه الأرض، وأنه كان حقاً كما قال عن نفسه، وأنه فعل ما قال الإنجيل أنه فعل؟
A universal consensus of historians of Jesus would agree that Jesus came on the scene of first-century Roman Palestine as a Jewish itinerant preacher who believed that God had chosen him to usher in his kingdom, that he taught in parables, that he performed deeds that astonished crowds and that both he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms, and that he was crucified by the Roman governor Pilate on account of sedition. Now, these would be agreed upon by virtually 100% of historians of Jesus, be they Christians, agnostics, Jewish, or even atheists.
Well, of course, we know Jesus existed. The evidence is overwhelming. I am aware of some curious people out there who call themselves mythicists, who argue that Jesus didn't exist. But, you know, if we raise the bar so high in our requirements for proof and evidence, so high that we say the evidence for Jesus is insufficient to prove that he really lived, then we don't know anything from the past. We may as well stop talking about Alexander the Great. We may as well forget all about knowing anything about the Caesars, Julius or Augustus or anyone else, because that is ridiculous to insist on that kind of evidence. What else do we need? We have 4 biographies from the first century. We have letters from the Apostle Paul, and letters that everyone agrees are authentic, that Paul wrote them. And in 2 of the letters, the ones we call Galatians and 1 Corinthians, he talks about Jesus' own disciples. He actually talks about Jesus' brother James. And so how is any of this to be explained if there really was no such person, Jesus? I've heard mythicists even say, oh, there was no Nazareth. The village where Jesus grew up is just an invention. It's a mythological place. Well, we have an inscription from antiquity with the name Nazareth inscribed in stone. That's pretty good evidence. We've gone to Nazareth. We find ruins that date back to the 1st century AD and the 1st century BC. So of course there was a Nazareth. So this eccentric view that Jesus didn't exist, I'm not aware of any serious, properly trained historian that believes that. Every historian, every well-educated person knows that Jesus existed, and the evidence for that is overwhelming.
There's absolutely no question that Jesus was a real historical figure. Bart Ehrman, who is probably the best-known critical scholar in North America, and he's pretty well known in Europe too, but he calls himself an agnostic leaning toward atheism. He wrote a book recently called Did Jesus Exist? To a group of people who are now being called the Jesus mythicists. Their demographics are often people in their mid-teens to mid-20s. They, for the most part, they're bloggers. They claim to be atheists. They're very radical. They're the main ones that say Jesus never lived. There's almost, and as Bart Ehrman points out in his book, there's only a couple well-credentialed New Testament fellows in the world who agree with these people who are doing the mythicists. There's only a couple of them. And he says none of them, as far as he knows, no mythicist holds a chair or teaches at an accredited university, college, or seminary. So everybody in the mainstream definitely holds that Jesus lived. Because we have plenty of information about Jesus from the ancient world. Do we wish we had more? Yep. But what do we have? Well, We have about 12.5 sources for Jesus. Most of the time they don't, I mean, if you get a paragraph, that's a lot of material. But a lot of times it's a one-liner. This Judean prophet who's proclaiming, and then you know they're talking about Jesus from what they say. And the most mentioned fact is that he died by crucifixion. So when they say, oh, it's a Judean prophet who was killed by the Romans, he was crucified. Well, then you say, yeah, I know what I'm talking about. I know what he's talking about. And they'll mention a number of things. Well, if all you use are the non-Christian sources, the best ones are Josephus and Tacitus. Another guy adds Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius. Tacitus and Suetonius are Roman historians. Josephus actually is a transplanted Jewish turned Roman historian. And they'll say if that's all you had, the critics, John Dominic Rawson, says if that's all you had, it's enough to say that Jesus lived. And Bart Ehrman lists a dozen. Remember, one of our tests for facts are the two heads are better than one theory, multiple attestation. He lists 12 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus. So 12 independent sources in the ancient world, whereas Paul Meyer, an ancient historian at Western Michigan University, says in the ancient world, one source is often all we have, he said, and two make an event impregnable. You can't, 12 for the crucifixion. The information is overkill.
The evidence that Jesus of Nazareth was an actual person is very strong. In fact, we've got non-Christian ancient historians who mention Jesus. For example, Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Mara bar Serapion, just to name a few. We have multiple independent Christian sources. Some of them are quite early. Some of them claim to be eyewitnesses. Of particular interest is Paul, the Apostle Paul, in his letters. Now, Paul says that he knew Jesus' brothers. Now, it's pretty difficult to know the brothers of someone who never existed. The evidence for Jesus' existence is so strong that virtually 100% of historians would agree that Jesus existed. Now, of course, you're always going to have exceptions, just like you have a few exceptions of historians who would say that the Holocaust never occurred. But these historians really don't have the respect of those in the academic community.
We know how the burial would have taken place, how the crucifixion would have taken place because of actual evidence. For example, one of the bone boxes, and this is, I should explain, the Jewish people would bury someone, 1 year later gather the bones and place them in a small ossuary, a little chest, usually made of limestone, and sometimes would write that person's name on it. Well, we found an ossuary in the late 1960s, and it contained the bones of a man who had been crucified. And one of the iron spikes was still in his heel, his right heel. So there is very clear evidence that, yes, crucified people were buried. The Romans permitted it. The Jewish people required it for the sake of the land, the purity of the land. So we have evidence like that. We have many tombs. Over 800 tombs have been examined in and around Jerusalem. 3,000 ossuaries have been recovered at least, and we still find them. Hundreds of skeletons have been studied. 138 crucifixion nails have been recovered from tombs. This is the kind of evidence I'm talking about. And Jody Magnus is an archaeologist in North Carolina. She's Jewish. She's not a Christian, so she doesn't have some theological axe to grind. And she has stated that what the Gospels tell us, the New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, those Gospels agree with history and the archaeological evidence. And she sees no reason why they shouldn't be trusted. I think she's right. I agree with her completely.
ماذا لو كل ما نستطيع قوله أن المسيح كان موجوداً؟ هل يمكننا أن نعرف بحتمية تاريخية أي شيء أبعد من هذه الحقيقة؟
Yes. We can know a lot about Jesus, more than yet he was a man or lived in the first century or whatever. I mentioned this 12.5 sources we have, secular sources, not Christian, non-Christian sources, obviously outside the New Testament. And if you put together each little snippet that they report, and sometimes more than one of them report the same snippet, we get about 60 different items about the life of Jesus, his teachings, what he said, what he did, details about his death, his claimed resurrection. I say claimed because a lot of the critics will say things like, well, they claimed resurrection, but do we know what happened? So about 60 things about all of that, and a few bare essentials concerning the earliest church, what they believed, what they did, how they worshiped, how they spent their time. About 60 different items without ever opening the New Testament and without ever opening a single Christian source. So yes, we have a plethora of sources, again, coming in from different directions. The most important facts we have concern the gospel message. Whenever the gospel is defined, you know, a lot of the writers will say, Paul will say, that's the gospel I preached to you. But when he slows down and defines the gospel, it always includes a minimum of the deity of Christ, his death, his resurrection. Deity, death, resurrection. Well, the New Testament's one more, maybe the biggest evidence now of reliability is we have dozens of little snippets in the New Testament. They're called, these are almost but not quite synonyms. They're called creeds or traditions or confessions or formulae. And even Bart Ehrman says a great many of them go back to 1 to 2 years after the cross. Now, when critics say, oh, Mark is too late at 40 years later, well, how about if you have dozens of these little snippets and reports about Jesus at 1 to 2 years after the cross? 80% of these little snippets, which are all the way through the New Testament, but they were oral statements before they were written in the New Testament. About 80% of them pertain to the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So that's the central Christian teaching. The New Testament's clear that that's the, you know, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God's raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Well, it seems like Paul. We say, oh, that's what Paul says in our Romans 10. Actually, it's not Paul. That's another one of those little snippets that Paul took from another source and repeated it here. So it's one of these early sources. So yes, we can know all kinds of things about Jesus, but especially where we major in the major, where we do the most talking and the most evidencing of the central facts that make the most difference. In this case, it'd be the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
هل حقاً قام المسيح من الموت؟ هل هناك ما يسمى بالمعجزات؟ هل بإمكاننا حقاً أن نعرف أن هذه الأشياء حدثت؟ وإن كانت حقيقية فكيف ننظر إليها في ضوء التاريخ والعلم والحياة؟
I got into apologetics many, many years ago, decades, due to my own doubts. And I was plagued, I think that's a fair word, plagued by doubt for 10 straight years and parts of about 15 more years. And I read and read and read and read, and I felt like I was losing my faith. And friends would say, well, check this out, check that out. Look at the reliability of the New Testament. Look at the historicity of Jesus. Look at archaeology. How about creation? How about new things in the news today? This woman was healed by praying to Jesus. You know, just anything they were sending my way. And it soon became obvious to me that if the resurrection of Jesus was what the claims were on its behalf, it could answer my primary factual doubts, but I had no idea if the resurrection could be demonstrated. So I started specializing in resurrection up through my PhD, that was my dissertation. About soon after that, my dissertation was published. And then a very few years later, I published a book on sort of only the first chapters of the resurrection. And the rest of the book is what's true in Christianity. If the resurrection is true, what follows? So since that time, I've had 40-something books, and 20-something of them, exactly 50%, are on the resurrection. So the short story is, it was there to help my doubt.
هناك سؤال يسبق هذه الأسئلة الكبيرة حول المعجزات والمسيح والقيامة، وهو التالي:
What is history? How do we accomplish history? Everybody in their own profession has tools and rules. They have tools which they use, and rules are the rules that govern the tools. Here's the tools we use, and here's how we apply them to the data in order to, dig out the gold nuggets that we think we found in the ground, and you keep working till you find out whether that was a good idea or whether it's not a good idea, whether it's evidence or whether it's not evidence.
Every historian is going to make a number of philosophical assumptions prior to engaging in every historical investigation. For example, historians are going to assume that they can have a partial knowledge of the past. They're going to assume that the external world is real and that our senses provide us with a pretty good perception of that external world. They're going to assume that logic facilitates us in learning the truth. Now, when it comes to a miracle claim, a historian does not have to assume God exists, nor do they have to assume that there is a spiritual or supernatural dimension. But the historian at least has to be open to the possibility of God's existence, of Him intervening in our world, or the existence of a supernatural dimension.
علينا أن نتساءل بأي حال ما إذا كان التحيز يؤثر على استخدام المؤرخين لهذه الوسائل. لا شك أن من يؤمن بأن ما يقرأه صحيح كدارس للتاريخ سوف يصل إلى نتائج منحازة.
All historians are biased. No one is neutral. And this is at least one of the things upon which virtually every historian agrees. Everyone is biased. No one is completely objective. I'm not, as a Christian, an atheist, an agnostic, a Jewish, a Muslim historian, whatever. They're not going to be unbiased. But if we're going to say that we should not trust the gospel authors because they were Christians and therefore biased toward their worldview, then we would have to say that we shouldn't believe an African-American historian writing on slavery in the United States. We shouldn't believe a Jewish historian writing on the Holocaust. We shouldn't believe a Muslim historian writing on the history of Islam. Look, if Jesus was who He claimed to be, if He actually rose from the dead, then the gospel authors would have been the very best people to write on this. They would have been biased, but the Christian message is the best message, the most wonderful message the world could hear. And so biased, yes, but they want to get that message out because it's true.
If I wear a historian's hat and don't presuppose any kind of religious faith or lack of faith, I can compare countless details in both the Old and New Testaments with information we have from secular history from many different eras and peoples in the ancient Near East. I can study the meanings of words based on their use in other documents written by other people from the same lands and times. I can learn about the culture and see how things fit together and are completely plausible in the time and place that they're attributed to. And certainly the New Testament books are at least one very plausible way that we can see Jesus' prediction there being fulfilled. It is, in part at least, an act of faith to say we believe these books are uniquely divine in their origin, but it's a matter of historical record to say we can demonstrate the truth of their claims at many, many points.
The task of the historian is to get a fairly good picture of what happened in the past. So the task of the historian is to collect and assess the data and to formulate hypotheses and to compare those hypotheses to see which one makes more sense of the data. And then we hold our conclusions with varying degrees of certainty.
هناك طريقة معروفة يستخدمها دارسو التاريخ لكنها تقيد نتائجهم إلى ما هو علمي محض. وبما أن المعجزات وقيامة الموتى إلى الحياة ليست أشياء علمية، فأن أي شيء قد يستنتجه مؤرخ جيد يتعارض مع القاعدة العلمية، أو ربما ليس بالضرورة.
Now, many historians who are engaged in historical critical studies believe that methodological naturalism is an essential component of the historical critical method. If you are going to investigate the claims, for example, of Jesus of Nazareth or the Gospels using the historical critical method, then you must work within the constraints of methodological naturalism. And that constriction basically says that you are only allowed to appeal to natural causes as explanations of the phenomena you're exploring. If you come to some phenomenon you cannot explain, then you are not allowed to go outside the natural realm and posit non-natural causes. You just remain agnostic about what the proper explanation is for that phenomenon. The question arises as to whether empirical sciences and the study of history require methodological naturalism. A good many historians and scientists would think that they do, but that would require some argument in order to support that conclusion. A methodological constraint is just a personal limitation that a particular researcher adopts, and why should he impose his methodological constraint upon anybody else? We'd need some argument, which I haven't seen forthcoming, for why one couldn't do science or history without this self-imposed constraint. Now, however that question might be answered, for me as a philosopher, it's somewhat irrelevant, because even if the historian or the scientist is prescinded from looking at non-natural causes, I as a philosopher am not forced to prescind from those. As a philosopher, I'm free to postulate any such causes as I think are necessary to explain the effect. So in that case, the historian or the scientist could lead us to the threshold of such a non-natural explanation, but then they would stop and hand the task over to the philosopher to carry it the rest of the way.
البعض يقول بأن هذا القيد أي منهجية المذهب الطبيعي ضروري لأنه يصف العالم كما هو. تدعي هذه الحجة أن الواقع يفرض علينا هذا القيد.
I don't see how a methodology can inform one's metaphysics, because a methodological constraint is simply a self-imposed limitation within which the particular researcher chooses to work. And it says nothing whatsoever about what is really out there. There could be all sorts of non-natural entities that explain the phenomenon that one is investigating, but one is simply prescinded by this methodological constraint from looking at them. And so I don't see how the adoption of methodological naturalism has any sort of metaphysical cash value.
ربما على المؤرخ ألا يكون مقيداً بطريقة تحد عمله بشكل كبير، لا سيما إذا كانت الطريقة تعتبر أن الواقع بكامله يمكن تفسيره بالأسباب الطبيعية فقط. وبما أنه ليس لدينا ما يؤكد أنه يمكننا أن نفسر كل شيء بالأسباب الطبيعية، إذن لا يوجد سبب كي نحد تفسيراتنا التاريخية بالسببية المادية.
If you're studying the resurrection and you want to dig in there, historians will oftentimes apply a set of criteria to see if what you're after are historical. So they have a list of rules that they used to apply. Strangely enough, New Testament scholars have taken these from historians and now they're applying them to the New Testament. But here would be some of the rules. And everybody's got a list that's a little bit different than everyone else's. But you'd ask questions like, do you have any eyewitness data? Because the supposition is eyewitness data is better than non-eyewitness data. How early is it? Is it early data? Because you can have an eyewitness and have it be a very old report. Earlier the better, generally, with eyewitnesses. Then there's certain rules. And you can, you might call one the two heads are better than one rule. It's multiple attestation. Do you have different people, different early sources who attest to this event from, hopefully, different geographical locations and all coming in with different data? So do you have a bunch of reports? That's multiple attestation. Do you have any enemy attestation? Somebody who says, well, I'm not like you and I don't believe what you believe. but I can vouch for your claim here that you're reporting truthfully. So enemy attestation is important. Embarrassment is important. For example, in the New Testament, there's a lot of things that happen that are very embarrassing to the person involved. For example, the chief disciple denies his Lord 3 times, or Jesus's brother James is not a believer, or the one who will be the best known disciple of all time, Paul, was not just your average unbeliever, but he sat by while Christians were killed. Those are embarrassing reports. The women were the first ones to find the tomb. That's embarrassing because if 4 different guys in 4 different parts of the Mediterranean are telling the same story, why do they all use women when in their own cultures you're not putting your best evidential foot forward by saying it's women? Why can't you say, well, since Peter and John ran to the tomb later, let's just start with Peter and John. Let's get the guys in here because they'll be better. Nope, they started with the women. Why did they all start with the women? Because that's what happened. So there's all kinds of rules like that, probably as many as 20. And you're trying to get in there and you try to apply the multiple sources, the early, the eyewitness, the whatever, and see what your case looks like. If you can take this fact and if you can evidence it from 5, 6 different angles, that would be a fact that most everybody would agree with because the backup is so strong.
ماذا يمكننا أن نقول عن قيامة يسوع؟ هل هناك أي دليل، أي سبب مقنع كي نصدق أن القيامة حدثت بالفعل؟ البعض يدعون مثلاً أن يسوع لم يمت على الصليب، وأن قيامته ليست إلا استعادة للوعي في عتمة القبر البارد.
Well, I think the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most certain facts that we know about Jesus. And archaeologists, historians, and scholars, Bible scholars, Jewish scholars would agree. There's only a small minority of people who would say, oh, Jesus didn't die on the cross. And that idea started 100 years after the death of Jesus on the cross. In other words, in the 2nd century, someone named Basilides, who for theological reasons, he was a Gnostic, he wanted to say that Jesus really didn't suffer on the cross. And he had his own theological agenda for saying this. And so he argued that actually it wasn't Jesus who died on the cross. There was a little bit of trickery, a little bit of magic that took place. And that poor fellow named Simon, who was from North Africa, who helped Jesus carry his cross to the place of crucifixion, he was the one that was nailed on the cross. And Jesus, he'd traded faces with the fellow. He laughs and he sneaks away into the crowd. What do the 1st century sources tell us? It's Jesus who died on the cross. Christian sources tell us this. Jewish sources tell us this. The Greeks and the Romans agree. Everybody agrees. There is nobody who says that anything else happened. It's only much later that someone suggests, oh, Jesus didn't really die, or it was someone else. So that's not a historical argument at that point. That's just some other philosophical agenda. But the real history is told in the 1st century documents.
إذن ما هو الدليل على قيامة يسوع؟
There's excellent historical reason to believe that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. And I would summarize that argument by pointing out that just 6 weeks after his crucifixion, his close associates were out in public preaching that he had risen from the dead. Now, they had everything to lose there and nothing to gain. They could have just gone back into the Jewish community and lived their lives. They knew that they would suffer great persecution, in fact, that they were risking death by doing this. And they testified to it in great detail. They said that he had talked with them, that he had eaten with them, that he had met with them on multiple occasions. That's not the kind of thing you can be easily mistaken about. It's not the kind of thing where they just said they saw him in the distance or they saw a kind of vision or something. So they would have been in a position to know. So either they were lying or they were insane in a particularly unlikely way, or they were telling the truth. And that gives us an excellent historical reason to believe that he really had risen from the dead, because they persisted in this in the face of all persecution.
The historical evidence we have for the crucifixion of Jesus is very strong. It is so strong that even atheist and agnostic historians of Jesus are those who are saying it is one of the most certain facts of the ancient world that Jesus died by crucifixion. Now again, when an atheist or an agnostic or a Jewish scholar is willing to say this, it's not because they have a Christian bias. Now, some of the evidence we have for the crucifixion of Jesus or his death by crucifixion is, number one, it is reported by even non-Christian ancient sources, such as Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian of Samosata, Mara bar Serapion. They all report Jesus' execution by the Romans. We also have multiple independent Christian sources that are quite early. So some of the Gospels can certainly be regarded as independent sources of one another. At least you have Mark and John being independent sources. And then you have Paul, who would be a source independent of the Gospels because he wrote prior to any of the Gospels. And although we may not know if Paul was an eyewitness, he knew eyewitnesses, and he talks about the crucifixion of Jesus. So there are a number of these things that we can look at in terms of sources. In addition, the Gospels provide embarrassing portrayals of Jesus in the Passion narratives. In the garden, Jesus is praying, and he wants out if possible. Father, if it's at all possible, let this cup pass from me. So he wants out of this if possible. And when he's on the cross, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, when you compare these accounts with the number of Jewish martyrdom accounts that were written in the same period, you find the Jewish martyrs saying, I could have forsaken your law, but I kept your law, O God, and I have not forsaken your law. In other words, they're saying, racks and stones may break my bones, but resurrection awaits me. But Jesus is saying, instead of saying, I have not forsaken your law, he's saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, we're in the 21st century, and a lot of times we don't see what the first century readers would have seen. And this would have been quite embarrassing to the first century Christian readers. So you would not make up and invent such accounts that would have been embarrassing to your own cause. And so this weighs in favor of the authenticity of the Passion narratives in the Gospels. We also know from modern medical knowledge that the chances of surviving crucifixion were very low. In fact, there's only one account in antiquity of a person surviving crucifixion, and that is Josephus reports seeing 3 of his friends crucified. And he goes to his friend, the Roman commander Titus, and asks as a favor that all 3 be removed. Well, Titus granted the favor to his friend Josephus, had all 3 of these victims removed, and provided the best medical care Rome had to offer. Despite this, 2 of the 3 still died. So the bottom line is, historians have to go with what's probable, not with what may be remotely possible. And given all the historical evidence we have for Jesus' death by crucifixion, without any decent evidence, at least equally good historical evidence to the contrary, the historian at least must conclude that Jesus was crucified and that the process killed him. In a nutshell, the evidence we have for the resurrection of Jesus, we go by facts and then we look at method. So facts, we could just say, here are 3 facts upon which virtually 100% of scholars, including skeptical ones, agree. That would be Jesus' death by crucifixion, that shortly after his death, a number of his followers had experiences of some sort, of some nature, that convinced them Jesus had been raised from the dead and had appeared to them personally. Now, that is not to say these scholars acknowledge that Jesus had risen and appeared to them, but they still say the evidence is still good to show that these disciples had experiences that made them believe Jesus rose and had appeared to them. And then third, there was a persecutor of the church, an enemy of Jesus named Paul, who was arresting Christians, throwing them in prison, consenting to their executions for being Christians, and then he became one when he had an experience he believed was the appearance of Jesus, the risen Jesus appearing to him. Now, what historians do is they take these facts and they formulate numerous hypotheses that attempt to account for those facts. And the hypothesis that it best accounts for those facts is regarded by historians as what probably occurred. The hypothesis that Jesus' resurrection was just a metaphor to say that his teachings and memory still live on, or that it's a metaphor for saying Jesus was vindicated by God in heaven. All of these hypotheses fail to explain the known historical data as well as the resurrection hypothesis. When we come to the resurrection narratives, you have a lot of critics who have pointed out what they think are contradictions. So, for example, was there one angel or were there two angels at the empty tomb? How many women went to the tomb? Was it just Mary Magdalene, like the Gospel of John seems to suggest, or were there multiple women, and so forth? Well, what's interesting, I think what's being used here is a compositional device called literary spotlighting. Literary spotlighting is when an author knows that there are multiple people involved, but they shine their literary spotlight by only mentioning their main character or a certain person, while not mentioning the others. So this is very common. In fact, in Plutarch's Lives, it's probably the most common literary device I saw him using. So when we come to the resurrection narratives, think about this. You have Mark followed by Matthew report one angel at the tomb, while Luke and John report two angels at the tomb. Could it be that Mark followed by Matthew is using literary spotlighting and shining the spotlight on the angel who's making the announcement of the resurrection? Or what about the women who went to the tomb? Maybe John is shining his literary spotlight on Mary Magdalene because she was the most important of all the women who went to the tomb. In fact, this seems to be the case because she runs back and tells Peter and the beloved disciple, they have taken the Lord and we don't know where they've laid him. Who's we? So when you look at the resurrection narratives, when you look at the passion narratives, when you look all throughout the Gospels, you find these compositional devices that were part and parcel of writing ancient biography easily and very comfortably explains more than 90% of all these perceived contradictions in the Gospels.
Well, we have a great deal of evidence, and we also have eyewitness testimony. And from a historical point of view, eyewitness testimony is extremely important, where we don't have to just connect the dots through inference, but we actually know what people saw and experienced. And so what we have then are four accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, at least two streams of independent tradition. Probably three. You have something in Luke, you have something in Mark that Matthew shares, and then you have something in John. So I would say we probably have three independent streams of tradition talking about the resurrection and who saw the risen Jesus and so forth. But you also have Paul, and so we're not being told about what Paul saw. Paul tells us what he saw. So Paul himself is a firsthand witness. And then he talks about others who saw the risen Jesus, such as Peter, the most important of Jesus' 12 apostles. He also says all the apostles saw him, including Jesus' brother James, who later became the head of the church in Jerusalem. And then Paul makes a very remarkable statement. He says more than 500 people at one time saw Jesus. And I think that rules out the idea of it's all based on a rumor or some kind of emotional experience or subjective vision or something like that. So we have firsthand eyewitness testimony. Then, of course, we have the narratives in the Gospels. And what tells me the Gospels are telling the truth is just the way the story is told. For example, they say women came to the tomb. Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene first. Well, women were not held in high esteem as witnesses or legal people or anything like that in antiquity. If you're trying to convince people, why have women come to the tomb who are confused and frightened? That's not a very good way of telling the story. That tells me they're telling the truth. They're saying, well, you like it or not, that's what happened. And so they're committed to the truth. So I find that important. But also I go back to what the archaeologist Jody Magnus said. Jody is Jewish. She's not Christian, so there's not some kind of theological motivation here. She looks at the gospel narratives of Jesus' death, his burial, and Sunday morning, the discovery of the empty tomb. And she says, that actually fits the way the Jewish burial traditions worked back then. That's what they did. So the Gospels are telling a very realistic, very truthful story. So when you take all those pieces together, eyewitness testimony, the verisimilitude, the reality of the way the story is told in the Gospels, and you put it all together, I think it puts a very heavy burden of proof on the skeptic who says, yeah, but I don't think he was resurrected. Let's explain it some other way. They all went to the wrong tomb, or Jesus wasn't dead at all. He just woke up and got out of the tomb. I think it puts a very heavy burden of proof on those who want to seek a different explanation.
توجد مشكلة في قبول هذه الحقائق، وهي ببساطة أن المعجزات لا يمكن إثباتها علمياً. فالمعجزة بحسب تعريف العديد من الفلاسفة مخالفة للنظام الطبيعي، وإذا كانت مخالفة لما هو طبيعي فلا يمكن أن تحدث. ولكن من خلال الاستشهاد بالنموذج القياسي للكون نجد اعتراضاً. إذا كان الكون نظاماً مغلقاً يعمل بطاقته وقواه الخاصة ولا يمكن التأثير فيه من الخارج، القوى الخارجية تعني بالطبع الله، باستخدام نموذج الكون هذا تكون المعجزة أشبه بالسحر. إنها استحالة بالمعنى الحرفي.
I think a good definition of a miracle is an event that exceeds the productive power of nature alone, an event that would not have happened unless something had intervened from beyond the natural order. Now, that gives rise to a pretty natural objection, a question that's actually raised as often by believers as by unbelievers. If God is the author of nature, if God has designed the natural world, then isn't there something a little bit odd about picking out a miracle, a specific thing, and saying, well, now this is a special act of God, but the rest of it is only a general act of God in some sense? Are we suggesting that God made a machine to run, made the cosmos as one gigantic machine, but then it wasn't quite right? He couldn't get it quite right on his first try, so he has to go in and fix it, fiddle with it. I think the answer to this is actually to go back to something that Nicodemus says to Jesus in John chapter 3. You remember the story of how Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night and he says, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher sent from God, because no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. Now, Nicodemus is on to something. Nicodemus has seen a great truth, which is you cannot have something that functions as a sign unless there's a backdrop for it, unless there's something that it stands out against. If I say to you, look, I have a white sign here. I've written you a message on it in white letters. That's not very helpful. You can't see what I'm writing unless there's some difference between the message and the background. There needs to be a normal order of nature which God has created, but in which he is not specifically constantly intervening before something can be seen as a special act of God, an act that shows us that God is with someone. So the very notion of a miracle presupposes that there is a normal order of events. But it also then allows that God, for reasons known to him, for important purposes, may from time to time step into that natural order, change the way things would be, and that is how we know an act of God. And the more that we know about science, the more that we know about what the physical universe can do on its own, the more clearly we'll be able to see, by contrast, things that could not be simply the natural order.
A lot of researchers in the life sciences have this idea that the universe is a closed system. And if it's a closed system, how can there be any entity outside that acts upon it? But those of us in the physical sciences are aware of, for example, the space-time theorems, which is based on two assumptions. Number one, that the universe has mass, and you and I are proof that it has mass. Number two, that the equations of general relativity reliably describe the movements of bodies in the universe. And today, general relativity ranks as the most exhaustively tested and best proven principle in physics. Based on those two assumptions, there are powerful theorems that tell us that the universe must have a beginning that includes the beginning of space and time itself. which implies there must be an agent outside of space and time that created and designed the universe. And so in physics and astronomy, we have proof that there must be some causal agent outside of the universe that's responsible for bringing the universe into existence.
ربما علينا أن نفكر بالمعجزة ليس كشيء يخل بالنظام الطبيعي، ولكن كظاهرة غير عادية أو كعمل من أعمال الله قليلة الشيوع في العالم.
You know, we talk about miracles all the time, and everybody has a different way of defining them. I would think of a miracle as an intervention by God or by an agent who's empowered by God, perhaps a prophet, that interrupts the natural order of events so that things happen differently than they would have happened if only the natural order were operating. Hume defined a miracle as an intervention by the volition of a deity. So he said it was a transgression of a law of nature by the volition of a deity. I don't really have a problem with that. Philosophers debate about what laws of nature are, so that's why I prefer to talk about the natural order. My real problem with Hume comes in his closed-mindedness to the idea that a miracle might have happened. So he said we could never be justified by any testimony in believing that a miracle had happened, an astonishingly strong claim. In the year 2000, a book was published by a non-Christian philosopher named Bart Ehrman. It was called Hume's Abject Failure. I love that title. It's a very, very bold title. And even though Ehrman was not a Christian, as a philosopher and a probability theorist, he pointed out that it's actually possible to overcome even a very low prior probability of an event if we simply got enough evidence that the event has actually happened. We see this happening in a lottery. The probability that any particular person will win the lottery is low, and yet we could be convinced that a particular person had won it. What's been interesting to see since then is that skeptics will yet continue to bring forward Hume's argument that there's some in-principle reason why we could not be convinced of a miracle. And in that way, they avoid looking at the concrete data that a miracle really has happened. And I would not call that a very open-minded approach. So I'm glad that Ehrman has, in a sense, opened that up and said, no, we really would need to investigate the particular evidence in the particular case.
I think as a historian, the historian should not make a judgment. A historian should not say, that can't be a miracle. The historian can only say, this is what people living back then saw and heard and experienced. A whole bunch of people said he was dead, and 3 days later, he's alive. That sure sounds like a miracle. But no scientist, no historian can say, well, scientifically, this is what happened. No one's in a position to do that. And so at that point, I think it's your worldview. Do you believe that God exists, that God intervenes in human history sometimes? Do you believe that therefore miracles can happen? It's your worldview that helps adjudicate and decide.
عندما نصل إلى هذه النقطة قد يتساءل المرء ما إذا كانت أي تفسيرات مقبولة ومعقولة. يبدو طبيعياً أنه علينا أن نجعل تفسيراتنا في حدود المعقول منطقياً. لكن في الوقت نفسه أن يقال أن الله لا يمكنه أن يجعل العذراء تحبل أو لا يمكنه أن يقيم الميت لأن هذه الأمور تخالف المألوف، فإن الأمر يضع قيوداً غير ضرورية على التفاسير.
I see no reason why a miracle must be defined as the least probable explanation. It may be the least probable explanation by natural causes, I'll grant that, but a miracle is not thought of as an act of natural causes. It's referred to or thought of as a divine act. And if God wanted to do something like raise Jesus from the dead, then that becomes the most probable explanation, not the least probable. If we were to say that Jesus was raised by natural causes, well, yeah, that's impossible. That would be the least probable explanation. But if we said God raised Jesus, or that he was raised by a supernatural cause, all bets are off, because we're not talking about a natural event. We're talking about a supernatural event. And so what can you say about the probability of that? You would have to know either that God does not exist, the supernatural realm does not exist, or that if God exists, he would not want to have raised Jesus. And that is something that an atheist or an agnostic cannot claim to know.
إن السبب الذي جعل البعض يرفضون فكرة المعجزات ينبثق من نظرة إلى العالم على أنه نظام مغلق. يمكننا أن نتخيله كصندوق محكم الإقفال. إن كان هناك 5 أشياء في الصندوق، لا يمكن للمرء أن يجد 6 أشياء في الصندوق في وقت لاحق ما لم يتم فتح ختم الصندوق والتلاعب به. بالتالي إذا كان الكون نظاماً مقفلاً، فيجب استبعاد إمكانية تدخل الله فيه.
In physical science, we often speak of certain systems as being closed or isolated systems where no outside influences are intervening, making things happen. You can think of a closed box that you might get from a furniture store, and you know that you'll have to assemble the furniture once you open it up, but until you get the box open, you can't do any assembly. So it's a system that's closed until you snip open the ends of the box and open it up. The idea that the whole physical universe is a closed system where God himself, even if there were a God, even if he wanted to, could not intervene, would stop any appeal to the miraculous or the supernatural. But that's just another way of smuggling in the assumption that naturalism is the only possible way to do rational thinking, that it's by definition, the only means we can use in science. That's a kind of philosophical smuggling to which we should object. We should say it is not something we can assume without evidence and argument that the universe is a closed system, that it behaves much of the time in accordance with certain rules, which we call the laws of nature. That is true, but that is also presupposed in the very concept of a miracle, which needs there to be a stable order of nature, a way things happen on their own, before a miracle can stand out against that and function as a sign in a religious context. One of the most common objections to allowing space for the miraculous is that once we do that, we'll just have thrown the door wide open for all kinds of nonsense. So even a devout Christian does not believe every miracle claim in every religious tradition that has ever been put forward. But if you don't exclude miracles right at the beginning, how do you block this great torrent of miracles from every quarter? Now, here I think we need to make a distinction between what is possible and what is probable. I think we should admit, yes, it is possible that there are miracles that have occurred in these other traditions. We need to evaluate those claims the same way that we would evaluate our own, by evidence. But when you say that, people say, okay, but now there's just too many of them. Where should we start? And here I think one of Hume's contemporaries, a bishop named John Douglas, came up with some really reasonable criteria for evaluating miracle claims. He says, ask yourself, when a miracle claim is put forward, was it advanced close to the time that the miracle is supposed to have taken place? So there are miraculous things attributed to the Greek philosopher Pythagoras. But the accounts we have begin 800 years after his death. That's a long time for legends to develop. Second criterion that Douglas puts forward, were the accounts first issued very far away from the place where the miracle was supposed to have taken place? Because when they're first issued at a distance of hundreds or thousands of miles, it's very difficult to check up on them. The third criterion he asks us to consider is whether the miracle claim was put forward in an environment where, even if it was false, people might have just let it go. Maybe it aligned with their own religious prejudices, and so they weren't inclined to look into it too closely. But in the case of the resurrection of Jesus, none of those criteria for doubt is met. The resurrection was proclaimed right in the same season when it was said to have taken place. It was proclaimed in Jerusalem. It was proclaimed in the face of opposition from people who had the means and the motive and the opportunity to show that the claim was false if it were false. So once you sort through the great cloud of miracle claims from religions, you'll find that very, very few of them meet all three of Douglas's criteria. And when you've met those, when you've cleared those hurdles, when you've passed those filters, then you have to look very carefully at something because you have fewer reasons to doubt it than you would if one or another of those factors were present.
تباعاً لهذا النمط من المنطق يواجهنا سؤال آخر: كيف يمكن لله أن يموت؟ إن كنا نقول إن المسيح هو الله كأقنوم من أقانيم الثالوث، والإنجيل يعلن ذلك صراحة، إن الله كان في المسيح مصالحاً العالم لنفسه، رسالة كورنثوس الثانية، كنيسة الله التي اقتناها بدمه، سفر الأعمال. هذه الإعلانات تواجهنا بمشكلة تفسير كيف يمكن لله أن يموت.
One of the problems people have with Christian claims about who Jesus is and what Jesus did is this idea that on the one hand, Jesus was the divine Son of God, but he died. He died on a cross. There's no question about that. And so this raises the question, well, how can God die? In fact, the Bible actually says that God is immortal. So how could God die? If Jesus is God, then how could Jesus die and be God at the same time? And when you put it in those terms, it seems like a real puzzle, seems like a contradiction. Until you get into the details, until you clarify exactly what the claim is, we're not actually saying that God as God died. What Christians are saying is that Jesus is a divine person. He is the second person of the Trinity. He is God the Son. But he took upon himself a human nature. And so there are some things that are true of Jesus as a divine person with respect to his divine nature, and there are some things that are true of him as a human. And what we say about Jesus, we need to be careful. Are we saying that about his divine nature? Or are we saying that about his human nature? So when we say that Jesus created the world, that Jesus was involved in the creation of the world, well, clearly we're speaking about the divine nature of Jesus, that as God the Son, he was there from the beginning. But when we say, for example, that Jesus was hungry, that Jesus became tired, that Jesus grew day by day, we're speaking, of course, about his human nature. We're saying that as a human being, he was hungry, he became tired, he grew in wisdom and knowledge. And that is how we need to think about the crucifixion. When Jesus was crucified, when he died, he was dying as a human being. He suffered a human death. He didn't suffer a divine death because there can be no such thing as a divine death. God as God cannot die. But precisely because he had a human nature, he was able to experience a human death. And in fact, that is why we needed Jesus. That is why God the Son had to take on a human form so that he could die and bear the just penalty for our sins in our place. There could be no atonement without the incarnation. And so we can see how these Christian doctrines actually fit together into a coherent understanding of who God is and what he has done for us.
من الجدير أن نسأل ما هي أهمية قيامة المسيح؟ يمكننا أن نفكر بما أنها معجزة فإنها دليل عمل إلهي في العالم. وهذا الأمر بالتأكيد له تأثيرات كثيرة على نظرتنا إلى العالم. لكن الأمر الأهم في هذا كله هو ما يشير إليه الإنجيل في مسألة القيامة، وهو أن المسيح تعين ابن الله بقوة من جهة روح القداسة بالقيامة من الأموات. هذا الإعلان يتضمن ألوهية المسيح، وبالتالي قدرته أن يدفع ثمن أعمال الإنسان الشريرة من خلال موته. وإن كان بإمكانه فعل ذلك، فيمكنه أيضاً أن يقوم من الموت ويحضرنا معه إلى الأبد.